Hello and welcome everyone. I am delighted to introduce my friend and colleague today, Dr. Stephanie Boonstra. As many of you will know, Stephanie is the collections manager at the Egypt Exploration Society and managing editor of the Society's Journal of Egyptian Archaeology. Her research focuses on the archives of the EES and on evidence for production in ancient Egypt. She completed her PhD at the University of Birmingham in 2019 on scarab amulet production in the early 18th Dynasty Egypt, and is a current member of the Amarna Project excavations researching the Great Aten Temple Faience inlays, which we will be hearing more about in this lecture, of course. In particular, her EES-affiliated project, the Amarna Great Aten Temple Faience Inlays Project 2022 to 2025. So this is the first EES research lecture on one of our EES affiliate programme projects. So here at the EES, we recognise the importance of networking between research projects to share expertise and experiences. So the EES affiliate programme is intended to support Egyptological research projects such as Stephanie's by providing this network as well as access to logistical services, funding, promotion and publishing opportunities. Affiliate status is open to any Egyptological research project and is not limited to those undertaking archaeological work. So please visit our website if you're interested in applying to be part of this programme. But now on to why we are all here today. Thank you again to Dr. Stephanie Boonstra for presenting Faience at Amarna, old and new research into its brilliant manufacture and use. Over to you.
Thank you, Charlotte. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak at this EES research lecture. It's very fun to kind of do this as a researcher rather than being on the EES platform as an EES staff member. So it's fun to be on both sides. But yeah, this talk will essentially be combining much of my research interests, which are the production of faience, the archaeology of Amarna, and even the EES archive, so all into one talk. So much of what I'll be talking about from around the midpoint onwards is ongoing research, so I look forward to hearing your thoughts and questions after, but I'll give a bit of background information into the topic first. So I imagine most of you attending maybe know, but some of you might not be super familiar with what faience is, other than this beautiful, often bright blue material that you see throughout Egyptian artifacts. So it's a human-made product that is similar to glass, but it is a much earlier invention. So faience originated from the same processes as glazing stone, which dates back to the Badarian period, so far prehistory in Egypt. So unfortunately, and somewhat uncharacteristically, the Egyptians did not provide much evidence for the production of faience and other vitreous materials. So despite there being countless depictions in tomb scenes of craftspeople making a wide variety of items, there are actually no concrete depictions of the production of faience, or glass for that matter. So this scene on the left from the 26th dynasty tomb of Ibi in Thebes, that's TT36, it provides the only suggested depiction of craftspeople mixing and glazing faience artifacts. However, the relief is fairly ambiguous, as you can probably tell. There's no caption to say that they're making faience. And from what we can see them doing, they might be doing something completely different. They might not be mixing and glazing faience. In texts, there is a stela for a man named Dabeni from Lisht, and it gives him the title of Overseer of Faience Workers. And we have 3 other 19th dynasty inscriptions that give similar titles, including this faience stele on the right of Rekamun, who was described as a maker of faience. However, there are no other known attestations of faience workers in pharaonic Egypt, and the Egyptians seem to be quite secretive of the production process in general. So most of what we know of faience production comes from the more scientific and experimental approaches to the study of the material. So chemical analyses, as well as many very determined scholars and enthusiastic amateurs, have provided us with invaluable information on the chemical makeup of faience and the methodology for how ancient Egyptian faience artifacts were made. So these studies have shown that the main ingredients used to create faience are pretty much the same used for the production of ancient glass. So the main ingredient of faience was silica, which can come from pure silica sand, but was more easily obtained as crushed quartz pebbles, such as these ones, which were found at Amarna and are now at the Petrie Museum. An alkali flux was also vital to the creation of faience, which could come from natron, so famously from the Wadi Natrun, or from the ash of halophytic plants. The final main component to faience was lime, which was easily accessible in the form of burnt limestone. Mixing these materials together would create a gray-white paste. In order to get the vibrant color of choice, a colorant was required. Copper was by far the most commonly used colorant, which created the turquoise color, but other colorants could also be used, such as cobalt, which created a dark blue, and cobalt first became popular in the 18th dynasty. So the main ingredients, so that's the silica, the alkali flux, and the lime, would be mixed into a paste and then formed into the object of choice. So this could be done free form or by pressing the paste into a ceramic mold, which would allow the mass production of amulets, beads, pendants, etc. So here are some terracotta pendant molds from Amarna that are now at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. So once the object was removed from its mold and then left to dry, finer details could have been carved into the setting paste by cutting or abrading the surface. So after you have your formed object, in order to achieve the beautiful blue sheen, three main glazing methods were used. So there's efflorescence, which was the most common method throughout the Pharaonic period. So the colorant, so whether it be copper or something else, would be introduced into the faience mixture from the very beginning. And through a chemical reaction called efflorescence, it would create a nice, even, glassy colored surface after it was fired. So direct application, the colorant wouldn't be introduced into the mixture of the object, but after the object was already formed, a slurry was made separately that used the main faience ingredients as well as water and introduced the colorant. And then the object would be submerged into the slurry or would have the slurry painted over it. And then the object would be fired at a lower temperature to reduce running and pooling of the glaze. And then finally, cementation is a method that required a higher copper content and was the least popular method of glazing, and in fact wasn't used until the Roman period. But essentially, the formed object was immersed in a powdery mixture that included the colorant while firing, and then that was chipped away after it was fired, and you had a nice, even glazed surface. So obviously the final necessary step after glazing was, of course, firing the object to both activate the glaze and harden the material. So now that we kind of briefly know how faience is made, we'll move to Amarna. So the ancient city of Akhetaten, which translates roughly to the horizon of the Aten, was founded by the 18th dynasty pharaoh Akhenaten around 1348 BCE as a new religious capital for the cult of the Aten. Akhetaten, now commonly called Amarna or Tel el Amarna, is situated in Middle Egypt, nearly exactly halfway between the main centers of Memphis in the north and Thebes in the south. The perfect secluded spot for big religious and political changes. The city grew rapidly in the mid-1300s BCE. However, after the death of Akhenaten and the subsequent move back to the previous religious norms, Amarna was very quickly abandoned, making the city an amazing archaeological snapshot of life, as many people just took what they needed and left the rest. So for this part of the talk, we will mostly be focusing on what excavators have called the main city, which is densely filled with housing. This area was the earliest major residential area within Amarna and covers over 1.5 square kilometers and contains over 2,000 houses. The houses in the main city were arranged along 3 north-south roads that connected this area to the central city. So these roads are now called, from right to left, East Road South, which is also known as High Priest Street, West Road South, and Main Road. And the Main Road is largely in line with the modern road and likely connected to the Royal Road of the central city. So off of these roads, the houses are more individually placed and built to suit the purposes and wealth of the occupants. So this image is from a large model of ancient Amarna that shows an area of the main city off of one of the roads and depicts how varied the settlement was. So many of Amarna's famous residents lived in the main city, and it is also the main hub for the evidence for industry at Amarna. So, although I could spend a full hour just talking about the various workshops at Amarna, regrettably, we don't have that kind of time, and I'm sure many of you are on your lunch breaks. So I'm going to focus on 2 case studies of workshops that were originally excavated by the Egypt Exploration Society, but then have been more recently re-excavated and studied. So we're going to start with the bead workshop of M50 14 to 16 in the main city south, which was re-excavated by Dr. Anna Hodgkinson's team in the 2010s. And I think I spotted her in the room. So if you have any detailed questions about that, I might have to defer to her, but she does have some exciting publications coming up on that project. So although this area was initially explored by under the direction of Leonard Woolley for the EES in 1922, Anna noted an area of vitrified mud brick debris on the surface, which she knew was an indicator of high temperature industries. The complex comprised a domestic house. So you can see it in the plan. There's M5016, which was a typical Amarna house in layout. So that's in the top left. A second building to the east, which is M5015, and a surrounding courtyard, M5014. Where the excavation work focused over 2 seasons in 2014 and 2017. So over the course of the recent excavations, Anna's team discovered almost 69 kilograms, that's over 150 pounds, of vitrified clay, mud brick, and sandstone, some of which you can see in this photo in situ, as well as excavated fragments to the right. So the vitrified materials was only just a part of the evidence that she found. What the team found was the clear evidence of a glass and faience bead workshop, including a clay-lined oven pit for firing, which you can see in this photo, glass ingot fragments, glass rods, over 100 chips of glass beads and wasters, approximately 580 faience beads, 100 of which were bead wasters, and molds, including my favorite here of a scarab. And they even found the faience scarab that perfectly fits the mold. Although the industries of glass and faience production are very closely aligned, the difference in production is a matter of proportions of ingredients and the heat of the kiln. In 2017, they also found evidence of metal and stoneworking, all as a larger part of the bead making process. The dense variety of activities visible in the bead workshop is reminiscent of the scene from the Theban tomb of Sobek-Hotep. This relief is now in the British Museum. So you can see the crafts people drilling, polishing, and stringing beads onto necklaces, as well as full strings of beads and completed jewelry dotted about. So to the right of the scene are crafts people working precious metals. They're operating a blowpipe to fan the flames while holding a piece of metal in the fire. So although we must be cautious not to take these scenes too literally, the presence of multiple materials being worked in the same scene does nicely echo the archaeological record from workshops such as the M51. And if you haven't yet, I do highly recommend you check out Anna's work. She has published multiple articles about her work, including in the EES magazine Egyptian Archaeology, which I'm sure Charlotte can share a link to, which is free to read online. And really excitingly, we'll be publishing the results of these excavations in a large EES monograph, which I believe should appear next year. As a part of her investigations, she and other members of the Amarna Project even did some experimental glass bead making on site a few years back. And so here you can see Anna at the back holding the glass rod while Miriam and Cordula ventilate the fire with copper blowpipes. And here you can see the results of their work, which naturally included some errors or wasters, just the same as we find in ancient workshop remains. And just northeast of the M50 workshop in the main city is the house of Ra-Nefer, who was a chariot officer. So after the reinvestigation of the house of Ra-Nefer in the early 2000s, Barry Kemp and Anna Stevens decided to continue re-examining the area to the south of it within the N50 grid square. So along with the new houses, which you can see in the plan to the left, a previously excavated house, N5023, which you can see on the plan to the right circled in orange, was re-excavated as the original excavators noted that there appeared to be evidence of glass and faience production. So over the 2 seasons of excavation of grid 12 and the adjacent N5023, the team found that throughout the entire area, there was extensive evidence for the manufacturing of various products. Some of this evidence was in the form of fragmentary ceramic crucibles. So that's bits of pottery that had partially vitrified interior surfaces that denote that they were in contact with very high heat and were used in the reworking of bronze. They also discovered glass rods, ribbons, and bars, as well as fragments of glass ingots. So that's all telltale signs of the manufacture of glass beads and jewelry. But also in grid 12 was the evidence of faience production, particularly of inlays and tiles, which I'll show you more very soon. So interestingly, much of the production evidence is from an earlier archaeological level than the houses themselves, which may mean that grid 12 was a production zone and then the houses grew up around it. The discovery of this faience production zone at grid 12 led to some interesting experimental archaeology for the production of faience at Amarna by Mark Eccleston. So he used a replica bread oven that was already had already been made at Amarna, and he was able to successfully fire faience tiles and amulets that he and the team made, proving that bread ovens could reach the high temperatures required to fire faience. He also experimented at direct application glazing of faience tiles, which also had some success. And as far as I'm aware, this is the first time that faience has been replicated in Egypt using the materials and techniques that would have been available during the New Kingdom. And again, you can read more about his experiments in Egyptian Archaeology magazine, which is free to read online. So that was a very, very quick overview of some of the evidence of faience production, just to kind of give you an idea of the workshop remains at Amarna before we kind of switch gears and look at my current research. So we're going to now move slightly to the north of the main city to what is called the central city. So the central city of Amarna, essentially the core of the city, contained many of the buildings described in the monumental boundary stelas set up at the foundation of the city. And thus, these were the elements of the city that were the most important to the pharaoh Akhenaten, his family, and the cult of the Aten, such as the Great and Small Aten temples, industrial food complexes, military quarters, the Great Palace, and more. So the largest structure at Amarna that was located in the central city was the Per Aten, or House of the Aten, which is now called the Great Aten Temple. It was the ritual centerpiece of the city and was a vast open-air complex dedicated to sustaining the Aten. It had a mud brick enclosure wall that was nearly 1 kilometer long. However, most of this courtyard was left empty. The temple was rapidly cleared in the 1930s by John Pendlebury and his team, and not particularly well recorded. Thus, starting in 2012, Barry Kemp and his team, the Amarna Project, began re-examining the temple to try to make sense of it all and confirm that it had two main construction phases. In its final phase, the enclosure wall contained two main buildings, the so-called Long Temple, which was likely called the Great Aten or Discovery of the Aten, which is on the Royal Road side, and there was also a sanctuary towards the rear. The Long Temple contained at least 6 open-air courtyards, within which several hundred offering tables have been discovered. Another benefit to the re-examination of the Great Aten Temple is the discovery or even rediscovery of many of the finds that Pendlebury's team either missed or chose not to keep and record. So some of those finds have been carved stone reliefs from the temple architecture, but another artifact type, which has been the focus of my research project at Amarna, has been fragments of decorative faience tiles and inlays. So in February 2022, I began the examination, cataloging, and photographing of the inlays. Here you can see a few of the highlights that I have examined. So parts of a bird, a fish, and water lily or lotus fragments. And you can read more about this in the reports to the Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities. Most of these inlays are monochrome, so not like those beautiful ones we saw in the opening slide. So these are either the typical faience turquoise blue, the darker cobalt blue, but we also have green, yellow, and even red. Some others have been polychrome with beautifully detailed, albeit fragmentary scenes, particularly of flora and fauna. In this photo, you can see an array of fragments of bird inlays. It's basically a very fragmentary puzzle where most of the pieces are missing. So it's quite frustrating, very few joins. But we know that with faience in general, objects, as I mentioned earlier, objects could be mold-made or hand-modeled. By and large, this is the same for inlays, but it does differ slightly. So many of the inlays, particularly those monochromatic ones, were made from a larger parent tile. The faience would have been shaped into a large flat tile, likely no larger than 7 by 11 centimeters. So after firing these parent tiles, they were then reduced to smaller shapes by grinding linear grooves into the reverse, along which they were then snapped. So this piece from grid 12 really well shows that kind of making this parent tile smaller. So you can see that there is one original edge, so it's the top edge in the picture, over which the glaze extends. And then there are 3 snapped edges. The groove on the reverse of this piece, which you can still see, likely represents an abandoned attempt at reducing the piece further into a triangle shape. So they had started abrading it and then decided to stop. The image on the right shows how a parent tile may have originally looked, with actual inlays excavated from grid 12 placed within. And if you want to read more about that, the Kemp and Stevens volume, Busy Lives, has a great section on inlays. The inlays which have original edges, such as this fragment in the top left from M50, shows an irregular convex edge over which the glaze often runs. So by kind of knowing how the different edges, how a snapped edge would have looked versus an original edge to a tile, we can kind of learn a bit about the production method. The parent tile method of creating faience inlays would have allowed the production of many small monochrome inlays in a relatively quick period. However, that method would not work for all. Therefore, many of the inlays and tiles were individually formed. This could either be in a mold. However, there isn't a whole lot of evidence for inlay molds that I'm aware of, or hand modeled. The hand modeling was certainly the method for the creation of the decorated inlays of flora and fauna, such as birds and fish. And you can particularly see that it's evident with the shaping of the head. I don't imagine there's any easy way to try to shape a head like that from a parent tile, it would be easier to just form it by hand modeling. So some of the polychromatic inlays were decorated with painted decoration. This is particularly clear on the bird and fish inlays that we just saw. Some, however, were decorated prior to firing, such as these water lily or lotus fragments. So the largest piece in the middle here, for example, had a predominantly cream glazed base. However, a sharp tool was used to cut into the efflorescent surface while the object was still drying before it had fired, to remove some of the cream glaze and insert a darker blue, almost purple glaze. And you can see that there is some bleeding over the edges from this. More dramatically is this fragment of a decorated tile with a poppy on it. So again, the fragment has a predominantly cream base, but during drying, certain sections were cut out and other colored faience pastes were inserted, including the green for the leaves and red for the poppy flower. And in the section, the side image, you can see that the red glaze, much of which is now gone, is cut quite deep into the object. So we've discussed the production of these, but what were they used for and where? Preliminarily, we think these fragments would have formed a wall or floor of a structure located between the Long Temple and the western enclosure wall of the Great Aten Temple. Perhaps this was part of a small royal apartment. And in fact, it does seem that most of the evidence of decorated faience inlaid scenes that we have are from palace contexts at Amarna, so that would fit the hypothesis. After starting the research into the distribution of the pieces, it's clear that the tiles and inlays originate both from spoil heaps, where their original contexts are lost, and from previously unexcavated ground. The latter shows a concentration in the area of this so-called small palace, strengthening the previous hypotheses. The foundations of this small palace were re-excavated in 2013. So this is a 25 by 14.25 meter structure and is situated just 1 meter east of the western pylon. So if you visited Amarna, it's likely that when you saw the Great Aten Temple, you were standing right in front of this small palace. It was in antiquity dismantled down to its first course of limestone building blocks or talatats. It may have once contained a throne and a window of appearance based on its architecture and possible representations in the tombs of Penesi and Mary Ra. So here is the result of the initial examination of the distribution of these inlays. So each number represents how many inlays in total were found in each of the 5 by 5 meter grid squares used in the Great Aten Temple mini grid. I do apologize, it's very hard to see the numbers on this screen, just because there's a lot happening. Basically, most of the inlays were found kind of along the bottom, basically on top of and to the west of the western pylon. This might seem quite confusing. I'm not suggesting that they were part of the pylon, but this is actually the location of Pendlebury's 1932 spoil heaps. So this is the loads of them were found in these spoil heaps from Pendlebury's excavation. So alas, that means the original find spots for all of these inlays, the majority of the inlays is lost. However, it does seem likely to me that these spoil heaps would likely contain the spoil of an excavation that was happening nearby. So it's possible that the inlays did originate from that general area of the temple, but we'll never know for sure. The secure contextualized inlays were mostly just to the east of it, around the area of the small palace. But of course, this is also a bit of a red herring because we must remember that the Great Aten Temple and the small palace was completely demolished in the New Kingdom. So we're not sure how the inlays would have scattered after the destruction. Considering none of these faience fragments that I've highlighted were found actually inlaid into anything, the question of what these pieces were ultimately used for remains. It's conceivable that they were set into wooden or stone architectural elements or furniture, and this fragment of a wooden object found in the Great Palace, so at the far left of the screen, during the 1934 to 35 ES excavation, has indentations deep enough to allow inlays. Furthermore, it appears that there might be gypsum remains in the recesses. It's feasible that other wooden objects into which faience was inlaid have since decomposed and only the inlays remain. In terms of stone architecture, Petrie published this rendering on the right of a gilded capital inlaid with faience in his 1894 publication of Amarna. And whatever your opinion of Petrie is, he did have a frustrating tendency to publish all of his theories as fact, often without providing the supporting evidence. So we're not always sure how he came up with this rendering. Some evidence we do have is this photograph at the bottom left from the ES excavation in 1936 to 37. You can see stonework with indents that would allow a faience inlay or another type of inlay to be inserted and held into place with the aid of some gypsum. Gypsum was a very popular material at Amarna and was used primarily as a sort of mortar for the foundations of buildings, but also seems to have been largely used for inlaying faience pieces as an adhesive. I have started to try to note any time that I have found gypsum traces on the inlays, but this is sometimes difficult as some inlays may erroneously have gypsum on them just due to the fact that they were found in contexts that would have also had exposed gypsum for the foundations, because again, this destruction. Again, we're trying to talk about making sense of the original architecture of a place that was thoroughly dismantled in antiquity. I will continue to investigate the usage of these inlays, but I don't imagine any concrete evidence of their use is likely to be found, as there are very few examples of these faience inlays found in situ, inlaid into their original place at Amarna. Although, again, Petrie in his 1894 publication, he stated that within the Great Aten Temple enclosure, he discovered another block there was inlaid with glaze work, a flying duck, naturally painted, still occupying its place. Unfortunately, there does not seem to be a photograph of this flying duck, and I don't know of any other information about it. I'm not sure what happened to it, if it was removed from site and sent to a museum, if he imagined it in a dream, I don't know. If anyone knows more about this mystery duck, I would love to hear about it. So although I've yet to locate the duck, on the same page in this publication, Petrie mentions a piece of red granite with white alabaster inlays, which is this piece in the Petrie Museum. And I'd like to say a big thank you to Kristen Thompson for letting me know about this piece and the other stone inlaid pieces. Kristen has done some really interesting work on the stone inlays at Amarna, which is definitely worth checking out. Sorry, I meant to fix that for the try to ignore the scale bar across this picture. But in the Penn Museum, there is this interesting piece of stone that has an N hieroglyph still inlaid. This piece is also from Petrie's excavations at Amarna, but regrettably has no further provenance. The inlay is listed as obsidian, and thankfully with provenance, and also going with the scale bar, we have this piece that was found in the Great Aten Temple during the re-excavations led by Barry Kemp. It was discovered just in front of the first pylon of the Long Temple, and it also has a black, possibly obsidian inlay. And one of the things that Kristen, who again was the one who let me know about these pieces, that she remarked upon when she showed me this piece is how odd it was that despite all the care and attention given to carving the stone recesses and creating the inlay, how sloppily the gypsum adhesive was applied, which you can see oozing out around the edges of the inlay. And she even said, she's like, I don't understand why they couldn't have just wiped it away before it dried. And yeah, I don't know that either. Another really interesting piece from Petrie's work at Amarna is this beautiful object that is incredibly well preserved with most of its glass inlays intact, showing the cartouche of Nefertiti. Sadly, none of these interesting pieces have faience inlays intact, and in fact, it all just seems to be glass or stone. But one bit of evidence we have for an intact faience inlay is this object card from the EES's 1935 excavation at Amarna. So this sandstone block was found in the broad hall of the Great Palace with a rectangular red faience inlay intact, as it says. You can see it in the blue handwriting at the top. However, after the piece was excavated and recorded, it and many other pieces ended up in the so-called North House dump, which was a pit dug by the excavators to store excess finds. Excitingly, this dump was relocated and excavated between the 1980s to the early 2000s, and this piece was identified. Unfortunately, though, probably after it was dumped, the red faience inlay was no longer with the piece, but they did find many hundreds of faience inlays in the dump, which are now in the storeroom at Amarna. So maybe one day, if I have the patience, I can go through them all and see if I can find the one that fits, if it's not all broken into many, many pieces. So this research into the faience inlays and tiles found at the Great Aten Temple is still in progress, and this was just a teeny tiny bit of what I've been working on over the last few years. I hope to be able to spend some more time at Amarna maybe next year to finish analyzing the inlays and tiles. And as I've mentioned, there are also many research questions I still have regarding the manufacture and use of these inlays that I need to delve further into. So if you know of any pieces in any museums from Amarna where you've got a stone or a wooden object with that faience inlay still intact, please let me know. I also am hoping to contextualize these inlays from the Amarna Great Aten Temple Faience Inlay Project with the already known corpus of inlays excavated at Amarna in the past. And you'll be able to read a very, very short report of my work at Amarna in this year's Journal of Egyptian Archaeology Amarna report. So watch this space. So thank you, first of all, to the EES for supporting this research, and for Charlotte for inviting me to speak this afternoon. A big thank you to everyone who has watched this lecture, either live or on YouTube. And of course, my biggest thanks goes to the late Professor Barry Kemp for enlisting me to do this research and for all of his kindness and support at Amarna. I look forward to continuing this research in his memory, and I hope that you all found this interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. What a brilliant overview, especially the great introductions into both faience and AGATFI that you gave at the beginning, and such an insight into what you're working on, which I think we're all very happy to hear about. Your shall I say alter ego at the EES? No. So yeah, it's lovely to see you on the other side and hear about your research and your specialism. So thank you so much. I don't know if you have any final comments before we close the event.
Oh, just thank you to everyone who attended. Yeah, it's really fun to share what has been a really, really enjoyable project over the last few years.
Oh, great. And yeah, of course, if you're interested in other research projects at the ES, do check out our website. I think there was a link in the chat somewhere about other current research projects going on, and also the ES affiliate program, which is, as I said at the beginning, open to anyone, archaeological or otherwise. So yeah, thank you again, Dr. Stephanie Boonstra, for such an amazing talk and insight into your research. Hopefully we'll see you all soon at another ES event somewhere. Right. Bye, everyone.